of our fund with a particular focus on investment governance and organization. So those of you with long memories will know that the Railways Fund was always known for its investments in art, which is something that my forebears, my predecessors, did in the 1970s, and they did that because there weren't any index-linked gilts at the time. They didn't start until 1981, and inflation was high. So why am I telling you this? Well, only to show that we were quite an innovative investor back then. It was a world when I think everyone more did their own thing before the rise of the, forgive me, Roger, consultants and the homogenization of institutional investment. But somewhere along the way, we lost our investing mojo. And I would see a major step on that process was 1987, when we actually outsourced our fund management. It was the right decision to take at the time, I'm sure. It was actually taken because those of you with reasonably long memories will know that the City of London went through its big bang around then. And suddenly we went from the old cozy world of jobbers and brokers to what we see now, much more international, large investment banks. And I think the management at the time felt that continuing to employ internal fund managers on terms and conditions which were in some way related to those of train drivers was probably not going to work in that world. And that was the very good reason why they changed what they did. But pretty quickly, I guess, the trustees realized that they needed some internal expertise, and we've been kind of on a gradual march back from there, really. But the scheme we have today was largely shaped by privatization. We now have 110 different sections in the scheme, as some of you will know, really 110 schemes stitched together, and our job is trying to create and drive economies of scale despite that structure. But I think we've gone down a few wrong cul-de-sacs over time. We've probably tried to follow the commercial market too closely, so we have increasingly gone into specialized external management. Roger already mentioned hedge funds, LDI, and we've essentially followed a sort of multi-manager model, I guess, an outsourced model. This was all fine throughout the 90s and 2000s, I guess, until we hit the global financial crisis. And it wasn't the crisis itself that was the problem. I mean, we had a bad year in 2008, as I think everybody did. But we're a long-term investor. We knew that even then, and we can trade through dips in market valuations. It was more the realization subsequent to that actually double-digit returns probably weren't coming back for a long time. Now, ironically, since then, we've had a few years when there have been surprisingly high returns, mainly from bonds, remarkably. But nevertheless, I think the outlook remains, and I wasn't encouraged at all to think differently by Martin Wolf this morning. The outlook remains for essentially financial repression, low interest rates, and low returns from assets in general. And it's really in that environment that you have to think very, very fundamentally about the way you go about investing institutional money, and really make sure that you do it as effectively and efficiently as you can, and don't leave anything on the table. So that was our motivation. So what did we do? We set up an investment transformation program. That's what we called it. By the way, I'm really proud of that logo, the ITP logo. It reflects the way the Great Western Railway put their logo on locomotives back in the 1930s. Not a lot of people know that these days. But I like it. I think the Great Western Railway was a remarkable company, actually. It was essentially set up by Eisenbach Kingdom Brunel in the 1850s. And they built the first suspension bridge, first tunnel underwater of long length, transatlantic steamers, fantastically innovative. I'd really like to capture some of that for my investment team, and that's really one way of thinking about it. Of course, if you are innovative, not everything works. And actually, at that time, the Great Western Railway, it had rails which were 6 feet apart. It was called the broad gauge. And this was a really great design because it meant you could have big, comfortable carriages, steam engines that were stable and didn't tip over and pour scalding water all over people. It was a really great way of doing things. But unfortunately, everyone else didn't do it that way. Everyone else had rather narrower rails, 4 foot 8.5. The gents at the back will tell me if that's right or not, something like that. And eventually, the GWR had to accept that it was in a minority. It was going to have to get with the program. So it was the Betamax of its day, really. But nevertheless, very innovative, and that's what we strive to be. So we started this program. As Roger said, we were very grateful that we had people in charge who were far-sighted and open to change. So John Shillman was chair of the investment committee at the time, now chair of trustees. Actually, the chair of trustees at the time as well, Derek Scott. They were key people who really said to me, actually, well, Chris, you know those things you've always wanted to do. We think you ought to do them now. So we did call Roger in 2013, and we spent 8 months formulating our plan for the future. And we created a very, very long list of things to do, 400 and odd things. And in 2014 and 15, we've been working through the list. And we've nearly got through it, I think. We have been quite lucky, I suppose, that not too much has gone on out there. That might seem an odd thing to say, we have wars all over the world, but in investment terms, not a lot's gone on out there. Central banks have continued to rig the markets and given us some breathing space to actually make the changes we need to make. And actually, that's probably very important in helping us to create an environment for future success. So, what did we do? What did we do? We clicked the button. We really looked at every aspect of the way we invest the scheme, starting right from the top. What are we trying to achieve? What are our goals? What are the beliefs that we should employ to actually achieve those goals? And how do we implement? So, to say a little bit about a couple of those things, as I've already said, we're running a multi-section scheme, and that does lend you towards a model which can be quite incoherent in a way. What we've done is focus back down onto what's really important for our stakeholders, what the different sections of the scheme, the different employers, they have different goals, but can we characterize them all in a similar way? So we've come up with a risk-return liquidity framework which enables us to place every employer very precisely onto a continuum. And we've tried to implement using the minimum possible number of moving parts, if you like. So we have 3 different return-seeking vehicles within the scheme, essentially. And the main one, the growth fund, is it's characterized by the return it's trying to achieve over the long term. And it is, in Roger's words, one of those quite challenging long-term real return targets. We're aiming for inflation plus 4%. And that's what keeps our scheme affordable into the future. But for different employers, we'll notch that up a bit or notch that down a bit, provided that the risk can be taken. So we've recast the way we've organized the scheme. We've recast the governance of the scheme. So my trustees, they're a representational board, well represented here today, I think. Am I pointing in the right direction? You are over there, aren't you? Yes. They recognize that actually having an investment committee largely drawn from representational trustees was not the right model for the future. And they took the lead in helping me to set up a professional investment board, which is now substantially staffed by external non-executives with specific investment experience. So that's one important change. And they'll hold that board to account for the performance of the scheme. That board will hold me to account. And within the team, we've changed the way we organize things, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. I mentioned here value chain. This really goes back to my comment earlier that in a world of lower returns, you can't afford to leave them on the table. So we've probably been quite happy to pay relatively high fees in the past because we felt we were getting value for them. I think in a low return world, you have to really think, am I really getting value for those fees under every circumstance? And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about some of the cost disclosure we've gone through. Leadership and culture are down here at the bottom. I guess these are the building blocks of future success, really. We've actually put in place now a mechanism where we measure our progress in these areas on an annual basis, and Roger's helped us to set that up. Leadership's relatively straightforward. You have management structures which work, and are the people in the roles performing to them. Culture is much more difficult, and our initial evidence from testing it through survey, etc., is that we're making progress, but we have a long way to go. So, I've explained the risk-return liquidity framework. We have a new investment process that we've put into place. I won't explain the sort of rat run on the right. There are some distinctive elements about it which relate to the distinctive nature of the scheme we're running. But we're very focused on trying to find areas where we have a competitive advantage. In international terms, we're quite a medium-sized scheme, I would say. 21 billion sterling, 30 billion euro. We can't do things the same way as very large funds in Canada, say, or the US or elsewhere. We just have different amounts of capital to deploy. So we'll work with partners where we can and where it's appropriate, but we need to find our own way, and that's very much the way we now think about things. And we'll try as far as possible to be unsentimental. So things that we've held for a long time, philosophies that were held for a long time, they're kind of all gone in the bin. We have to see how they're going to add value for the future. Now, I said I'd say something about cost analysis. We've actually employed someone in our Darlington office that we colloquially call the forensic cost accountant, although I was told we couldn't advertise it that way. It sounded too much like CSI or something. We've really worked out that this is going to be a full-time job for the future, just continually digging into where we're paying costs and what they are. We've always done external benchmarking of our fees, and we've always felt that we were actually pretty good at negotiating. So if a hedge fund fee is typically 2 and 20, 2% management fee, 20% share, we were always really pleased with ourselves because we quite often got 1.9 and 19 or something. But I think that's just evidence of anchoring, really, and starting from the wrong place. Going forwards, we're being much more scientific and rigorous about what are we actually going to get from this relationship, what we're going to get from this investment. If we try and unpack the return drivers inside it, hidden betas, if you like, can we get access to those much more cheaply elsewhere? And if so, then what's left over? Are we getting enough from that to justify the relationship? So when we did actually look at where we were spending fees, we discovered that the fees we disclosed in our accounts were, well, frankly, the year we looked was about £70 million, which is 35 basis points. By no means a cheap scheme, but substantially actively managed. When we really dug into what was actually being taken out of the assets through pool structures of one sort or another, I've said hidden costs. That's slightly unfair. We normally knew that they were happening, but they certainly weren't put in our face. When we dug through the accounts for each of the vehicles we're invested in, we found that the total amount being paid out was more like 4 times what we were disclosing in our accounts. And that multiplier was quite a surprise even to me. And frankly, there isn't really much incentive from a career preservation point of view to disclose these things. Because as soon as we put those costs into the external benchmarking surveys, we're putting ourselves in a bad light unless everyone else does the same. So we're now arguing that everyone should be much more transparent. And that way we can really put pressure on the industry as a whole. So, as I've said, we're trying to be much more rigorous about finding where the sources of return are in our investments, and if possible, unpacking them. So we have made a large change in our equity portfolio to orient it towards what we call alternative risk premia. The vernacular is smart beta. I feel that I'm riding for a fall if I call it that. There'll be a year when it doesn't work particularly well, and that's fine. But really, it's sort of meta-analysis of the way in which equity markets work. It's really saying, are there trends here which can be shown to work over time? Over time is a phrase which is my friend. I am a long-term investor. I can wait for things to come good. And we are starting to internalize our investment management. We're doing so in certainly not a headlong way, and we're not at all trying to compete with the professional fund management industry. As I said earlier, competitive advantage is really important to us. Do we have a competitive advantage in trying to beat market benchmarks? Probably not. But do we have a competitive advantage in holding things for the long term and waiting for returns to come through? We do. So we may decide just to select a small portfolio of stocks and put it in a drawer. We'll hold individual bonds because they meet a particular liability need that we have. And we'll still partner with the external marketplace. There are a lot of smart people out there. We certainly don't think we have a monopoly on good ideas, far from it, though we will be somewhat more parsimonious about it, as I've said. But the most important thing is that we're going to be clear with everybody about the way we do things. That's going to save them time, and it's going to save me time. Now, within our team, we've tried not to set up too many specialist roles, I guess. So the word silo gets overused, but undoubtedly it's the case that if you have people who have a very well-defined role, then you have to give them things to do that fit that role. And we want our capital to be able to deploy more flexibly than that, I guess. So we're trying not to be captured by particular asset classes. So all my team work in they're all multifunctionalists, as it says on the slide, and they typically they're involved in 2 or 3 of 11 or 12 different functional areas that we have going on at any one time. And we're trying to espouse the philosophy of one team, one portfolio, so we're all contributing to the same outcome. It comes back to the culture thing that I was saying earlier. We have tried to change our compensation to fit the long-term nature of the scheme. Now, this is always very difficult, I think. You can't avoid employing human beings, and as human beings, we tend to want to be paid on some sort of human lifetime scale, well, every year or two, hopefully. But we have built in 6 years of performance into our investment team's remuneration going forwards. 3 years looking back and 3 years looking forwards. And that goes some way to aligning what I and my team are trying to do with the needs of the institution. We can't be as long-term as the liabilities. The scheme's still open, so they'll be clocking up for another 50, 60, 70 years. But we do what we can. But the most important thing is to be completely focused on the mission and the goals of what we're trying to achieve. Now, Roger, this is an area which we talked about quite a lot through the ITP process.
Basically, every change process could be focused on the sort of the hard and technical parts of the investment challenge, but it's completely incomplete if you do it that way. It's so much about people and culture when we think about the investment delivery. So soft stuff is clearly hard, but I think the two things that really have come into that area to make a difference. First of all, I think a lot of advances have been made in understanding how people work. Brain science has contributed a lot to this. So the motivations that people have and how they work better in teams as well. So how teams work and how committees should be structured. So these things are real advances. And I think the other advance that I speak to a lot is the idea that many things that we think can't be measured can be measured, and it's helpful to do so. And so at Rail, we have a 12-month assessment of how the organisation is progressing on these soft, difficult-to-measure areas. So we've run that twice, and we've got another one coming up this July. So each of those sort of makes a difference. So you can imagine this being very much about process, but really it's all about people.
But you have a thing, don't you, that it's important to actually write things down and try and quantify them, even if they are quite soft and sticky, because it makes it more real, even if you can argue that it's not completely concrete.
Well, role clarity and accountability, I can't stress enough how much that's needed. The organisation organisations by and large seem to get away with a lot by not having clarity of roles, and as a result, people can argue that they haven't got perfect accountability, etc. And so from that point of view, how you structure your, it's called a decision matrix, essentially, who does what in whatever circumstances, that becomes very, very important. And the clarity of the organisation will respond to something systematic here, yeah.
Okay. So, what does success look like? I'll tell you when we get there. We're very much a work in progress still, I would say. We've set out our stall to be a world-class asset owner, which I really, really think we should be, but it is quite an ambitious goal. Not a world-class asset manager. We want to be a distinctive asset owner. It is about owning assets and being a responsible owner of those assets and contributing to, well, not making the world a better place, but ensuring that we're aligned with changes that will happen as people recognize the need to change the world. So it is about being a coherent asset owner and achieving one way of working and acting. But why am I doing this? Well, it's all about the pensioners ultimately, and I suppose that's what we always have to come back to. It's my present and future pensioners that require us just to do the best job. And in a challenging world, as set out by Mr. Wolf this morning, I'm by no means complacent that we're going to achieve our aims, but we travel in hope, and hope that the light at the end of the tunnel is indeed light. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Roger and Chris. A great example of thinking differently and investing smarter. If I can just give the audience a few minutes just to gather their thoughts. You took a very structured approach to your ITP, which, of course, is a brand you're very proud of. And there were different elements of that. Which of those elements do you think added the most value?
Well, they're all interlocking parts, to be honest, but the biggest difference that I and my team feel day to day actually is that we really own the problem in a way that I wouldn't like to say that we weren't owning it before, but we really own it much more now. The delegation from the trustee board to the investment board and onto the executive feels much more real than it ever did. We know it's our job to make this portfolio work. And we can't hide behind, would I ever do this? I probably would have hidden behind external managers' underperformance in the past. And it was always very easy to say, well, the managers didn't do it for us this year. That doesn't work anymore. Even where we're using external managers, we own the portfolio.
So much clearer accountability essentially has made the difference. Yeah. Thank you. Right. Any questions?